Hello, Shirley. You're most welcome to Cornucopia Climate Chats. I'm delighted to be interviewing Shirley Clerkin today, who is one of my classmates from the climate class that I did on climate change and entrepreneurship. And Shirley works for an organization called Tóchar. And today we're going to be talking in particular about bogs and wetlands in Ireland and elsewhere. So you're most welcome, Shirley.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. It's lovely to see you.
Yes. And I know that you've spent a long time working in bogs and wetlands, and we'll go into that and how you got into it and all that and where you work now. But can you first of all tell our listeners and myself why bogs and wetlands are important?
Okay, well, thanks. I'll keep it fairly straightforward. Bogs and wetlands are natural habitats first and foremost, and because of that, they're involved in a number of cycles. So they're involved in the water cycle, they're involved in the climate, weather cycles, and they're involved also in composition and decomposition, so the food webs. But they were formed in Ireland after the last glaciation when there was a lot of water, melting, forming into lakes, and then gradually over time, different habitats formed over thousands of years. So we have a few different types of wetlands and peatlands in Ireland, but generally speaking, they provide things that are called ecosystem services. So that would be provisioning, which would be providing habitat, providing water, providing fuel, even. Then that would be like, regulating. So that would be regulating water flow, regulating the climate. Those kind of ecosystem services are really what makes them very important, both for other species and ourselves as a species involved in nature.
Can you tell us about the history of bogs in Ireland? How long have we had them? And have they changed over time, Shirley? The bog is so much part of Irish culture and our sense of self. So have we always had bogs?
Well, certainly since the last glaciation, which is about ended about 15,000 years ago or thereabouts, bogs have started to develop in Ireland. We've always lived with them ever since humans started to come into the island of Ireland. We have lived with them as they've evolved into forms. So you can tell that from the fact that, different fossils have been found in the different profiles of sediment in lakes, for example. You can tell that we have been living with them. We've been learning how to cross marshy places. We've been linking with each other human groups across bogs, for example, and wet places by creating bog walks or tohers and brush walks and walks made out of stone, for example. And then a lot of scientists have done paleobotany on the profiles of peat that are found in bogs, and they've been able to determine the different types of habitats we've had in Ireland over those thousands of years by looking at the pollen records in those. So that's enabled us to reconstruct the types of environments that humans have lived in Ireland, and it's always been a wet place. So we've been dealing with various forms of wet climates and wet habitats, and we've become very adept at that. So whether it's the log boats that are found at the shores of lakes, under sediments, or whether it's the different implements that have been found preserved in bogs over the years, you can see that we've had that ongoing relationship. And then I suppose it started to change really from the point of view of the amount of impact we could have on bogs with the Industrial Revolution and our ability to use steam and to create machinery that helped us change the land use of bogs in a quicker way.
Yes, so that's very interesting on the history of bogs in Ireland. And I suppose now is a good time to ask you a question that really occurred to me. What's the difference between a blanket bog and a raised bog, Shirley?
A blanket bog, first of all, is one that cloaks the uplands. So they're generally over 150 meters. They're up in the uplands, and the bog forms over the top of the rock or the geology that's on the top of a bog. And it's formed with a combination of moss species start to grow there, and they accumulate and they decompose very slowly, and they form this thing called peat. So you'd have a very shallow layer of peat on those sides, maybe 1 meter, 2 meters deep. The raised bogs are formed in lakes, primarily in the Midlands. So lakes that first of all form a ring of peat or fen habitat around the outside, which is formed with sedges and other mosses. And then that builds up gradually with the sphagnum mosses, which are the peat forming mosses primarily. And they're really a particular type of moss. And they start creating this kind of a scraw bog over the top of the lake, which gradually infills with all this peat over thousands of years. And then intention holds it all together and forms this lovely, gentle dome, which is the raised part, a bit like a raised cake over the top.
Yeah.
So a surface layer really of vegetation, the decomposed and composing layers, and then you're right down to the fen peat underneath.
Gosh, it's so fascinating. Raised bog, like a beautiful cake in an oven. As you
Yeah,
explained
perfect for you.
me before, that sometimes neighbors couldn't see each other across the raised bog. It,
That's right. Yeah, they couldn't. So if you were on one side of a large raised bog in the Midlands and your neighbours were over in a little hill that was of mineral soil and you were in the other little hill of a mineral soil, you couldn't see your neighbour until the big commercial peat extraction happened. And then all of a sudden you could see your neighbour's lights on the far side of the bog.
well, the extraction of peat, that's a big story for Ireland.
Mm.
But before we go into that, can you tell me a little bit, Shirley, about your own story from your childhood and how you ended up working with bogs and peatlands and how it all started? Who inspired you, maybe?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm from Monaghan, first of all, just to say so. I'm not from a boggy place or anything necessarily, but I suppose because we were living on the border when we were growing up, and there was quite a lot of children in our house, my parents had a family membership to the National Trust in Northern Ireland, which was a very cost-effective way of bringing your family out on a weekend or on a Sunday, because they had lots of really great sites, like the heritage sites that are now in the Republic, I suppose, and they were well managed. They had great walks and historic houses and lots of parkland and woodlands and things like that. So we used to go there every Sunday, and it was a great eye opener, really. I suppose that we were always out in nature on a Sunday, and it was just very relaxing and I suppose inspirational in a way. And combine that then with, I suppose, the strict, I'm going to call it strict regime that there was over the television in our house. Anyway, particularly for the older children, it might have reduced in severity as the children got younger and my parents became more benign. But when I was young, we had to watch documentaries and we weren't allowed to watch frivolous things on television. So thereby, I watched a lot of gardening programs, documentaries about the world. And then we were also a subscriber for the National Geographic magazine in our household. So we got that, and we also got a children's version, which is called The World. So we used to read all of those, and my mother had us in the library every single week to get all of our books, and our father had us going up the north to all the National Trust properties. So that was really formative, I think.
So education was really important in your household. And what did your parents work at?
My parents worked very hard actually, but my father had a bicycle repair shop that was his father's in Monaghan town. And my mother actually was a civil servant, but she had to give up her job for the marriage bar, if you recall. So later on, actually, she did pick mushrooms in the Monaghan village industries around. So people grew mushrooms in their own farms. So she picked mushrooms for years when we were in secondary school to try to keep the ship on the road or keep the ship on the sea, I suppose. There were 6 children in my house. There's my brother, and then there's myself. I'm the second eldest, and then 4 below me then. So it was a very busy house. I went to secondary school in Monaghan town in the St. Louis Secondary School. So they were a French order of nuns, actually, and they've only recently pulled out of town just this last year, actually. And they were very much about scientific education, drama, and music and art. And they were always saying things to us like, well, if the boys over in the St. McCartans can do it, do maths or science, so can you.
Well, great.
So they were really very women libbers, actually, very much so, I think,
Yeah.
um,
Or
without saying it.
yeah. And where did you go to college then?
I went to University of Ulster to do environmental sciences, and that was a super course, I must say. And because we were based up in County Derry, and we were field tripped every single week on a bus to different locations and around County Derry, and there was a lot of bog sites there, actually, really nice bog sites and coastal sites. So we were looking at geology and rocks and going across, looking at glaciated features. And in fact, the very first week of college, they told us to meet outside the college, to bring outdoor gear for a week, and they took us on a surprise magical mystery tour of County Donegal. And some people had never been to the north before, or to the south before, I should say. Some students had never been over to Donegal in their lives and had never used a punt, which is the old Irish money, by the way, for anybody listening. And it was just an amazing way to build a team, actually. Yeah.
And you were telling me before two things about your secondary school because we had a chat prior to this. One was about a nun who influenced you, who inspired you, a geography teacher, and the other was about Chernobyl.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So we had a great geography teacher for Leaving Cert. She was Sister Fiona, and that she had been very much into social justice and that aspect of geography. But she was very question based. So she didn't always just leave it to the book and what was in the book. And, some teachers are very rote based. Maybe things have changed since the 1980s, but she was certainly very much question based. And I think that really helped our class, actually, when I was thinking about it since we talked, that she was a really good teacher. And then Chernobyl happened when I was in secondary school as well. So the Chernobyl disaster, that was really pivotal for me because, you'll recall this as well, just watching the news as it came on the television at the news bulletins. I mean, you couldn't watch it live or see any of that. So it was unfolding over days. And then there was the whole thing where it was being kept secret and you didn't really know what was happening. And the terror of that, but also the awfulness of it to know that that whole zone was going to be a completely exclusionary zone, that the people were going to be leaving it, the humans were leaving it, and the impact that was having then on all the other species and the wildlife that was going to be there. And then, funny enough, when we went to college and we were doing lake sediments, we could see these sort of zones in the lakes. They were able to point out various incidents like that in the lake sediments of Lough Neagh, which I
Well,
just thought was amazing.
and
Mm.
things we spoke about also is what is soil? We spoke about, I asked you on a previous chat we had, what exactly soil is. And, we have our planet and it's made of the sea and the soil. And what is soil and how important it is to us that it's healthy?
It's the living component, isn't it? It's the bit that does all the living in one sense, and it's a combination of the eroded rocks, if for want of a better word, all that granular stuff that comes from the rock which is underneath, and then the decomposition of plants and animal remains. So all the leaf litter, all the plants sort of dying. Where do all the dead wildlife go? I mean, they're in the soil in some shape or form.
Microbes, you mentioned.
And the microbes, and what was I saying to you before? Oh, yeah, we're standing on the shoulders of microbes. And I heard somebody saying that at a conference, at the agricultural conference one time, and I just thought it was so true. We really don't appreciate the role that bacteria has in soil. And things like earthworms, you were saying about that, of course, and how they channel the soil through their bodies, even, so all of those activities, there's niches for everything, and everything has a balance. And everything's part of a food web. And to start disrupting that to such a fundamental extent that we have is having negative consequences for us now on the planet, as we can
Have more
see.
awareness and action around it. Yeah,
Mm.
it seems like there's two very important things. One is the sun, and the other is the soil. And of course, then there's the oceans too. So, what kind of flora and fauna live in the bogs and in the wetlands? And what are some of your favorite ones to bring them to mind?
Well, I mean, I think most people will know that bogs are buggock, they're soft places. So there's a lot of water, so the water levels are important in them. So then we have specialist species that really like water, and that's their thing, that's their jam, as I say. So a lot of moss species. So sphagnums would be the moss species that would be the bog builder, it would be called. So there's loads of different types. And if anybody goes for a walk on a bog, and I'll give you some suggestions, you'll see this really bright green, furry looking moss in the pools, and that's Sphagnum cuspidatum. But there's loads of different colours. There's pinks, there's bright jade greens, there's bright reds, and they're all this sphagnum moss. And they're brilliant. And if you're in a bog and you just pull up a handful of it, give it a good squeeze. It's like wringing out a dishcloth over your sink. There's that much water in it. It can hold 20 times its own weight in water. And that's why it's so important on the bog. So it creates its own habitat. It can't refuse the water. It's so open. It can't say, no, thanks very much. Not having water today. Thanks. It has to have it. You know what I mean? They're my favorite, I think, really, because they're just so iconic. And then other species that you'd find kind of a different type of habitat, which would be a fen, which would be also groundwater fed as well as rainwater fed, would be things like bog asphodel. And it's kind of a yellowy, spiky flower. And then there's this other one, which is called bog bean. And it's like a little white and pink fluffy thing that you'll see in a pool with kind of green round leaves. And it's just such a beautiful plant. And just another one actually would be the sundew, which people will be aware of because it eats insects. Well, it dissolves the insects. So it's really sticky little flat plant. It's called the sundew. And the little insects, God love them, they are completely unaware that they're landing on a carnivorous plant and it basically digests them. It's very nice, but it's super, super plant. And then bog cotton actually might be a plant that people would be familiar with. You know, it looks like a bit of cotton wool that you're going to use to clean your face with on a stem.
Wonderful, wonderful. And are there any animals that
Well, you know, you will get lizards and things on bogs, but there's a lot of bird species, you know, and if you're up on an upland, you'll get the hen harrier, obviously, but you'll also hear a bird singing and rising at the same time. And if you look around you, you'll hear the sounds close to you, and then it sounds like it's going away from you. I'm demonstrating here. I'm
yes,
circling my hand up and up and up and up.
ears away
It's a
from
skylark. Such beautiful sound. And, you know, there's a beautiful song that the lark ascending, you know. But I mean, that's really an inspirational sound if you're on a bog, the skylark rising, the skylark ascending. And then there's lots of little invertebrate species, little damselflies, which are only tiny, about the length of a matchstick, and then bigger dragonfly species. And the dragonfly species are quite noisy flyers, and they're carnivorous again, so they're eating other insects. And then the little damselflies are little much more delicate little, they look like blue matchsticks basically. So if you see blue matchsticks and think, what, I didn't really see that, you did. It's a little damselfly, and there's loads of different species of them, and they're really beautiful.
And now bringing us to the Industrial Revolution and the history of Ireland, and when we decided that peat would be our source of electricity with Board Namona and the establishment of Board Namona. And it was a very progressive thing at the time. Can you tell us about
Yeah.
that, Shirley?
Yeah, it was. And I actually brought you a little book just to show you, because you can see me. But this is a book that was done by Board Namona in the 1950s.
Wonderful.
And it shows the evolution of the bogs from pristine to what they were doing with them. And it's actually a beautiful book in that it's a story using photographs of what they were doing, right up to all the machinery that they were using, the new factories that they were building, and the villages that they were building as well. So the last photograph in this book is one of children playing in the green outside the village houses that Bord na Móna had built. And I think it's a very social history that's not really recognized enough yet as to the role that they had. It was an economic decision, but it was also social. They were trying to provide livelihoods for people in the Midlands using the resource that was there. And it was an extractive basis. So they dug up all of the bogs, they fed them into the electricity peat burning stations, and also sold them as turf as well. So it was a very big industry. And it was shut really, well, the big change of Bord na Móna came in 2020. Now, they were going to be closing anyway and cutting and stopping their turf extraction by 2030, but they did it 10 years earlier. And I think primarily because of a planning decision that said that they were going to have to get planning permission in retrospect for all of their previous extracted sites. So that was part of it. And then I think really the icing was on the cake, or the knocking was on the door, or whatever. It was coming to an end anyway, and they were wanting to move into renewables. So they made a pivot at that stage, and they pivoted into renewables, being a green company, and they got quite a lot of money from the government to start the restoration of a lot of those extracted sites. So
Yes,
that was the big change.
shock for the Midlands
Yes, for
and
the
for
Midlands.
the traditional industry and communities, etc. Your work since college, how did you end up working in that area?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, after I left college, so I did a few different things in college, actually, in fairness to me. I was one of those perennial students a little bit. So I did environmental science. I went to the King's Inns for a few years and did law. And I did another course then in DIT, which had a work placement with Brady Shipman Martin, which was great. And then after that, I started working in the Irish Wildlife Trust as campaigns manager for a few years, where we did lots of campaigns about the Wildlife Act and special areas of conservation and all that kind of thing. And then I worked for Antashka for 4 or 5 years doing their natural environment officer role. So I was doing looking at aquaculture applications and forestry applications, and I was writing complaints to the Commission about Ireland's EU environmental record and things like that. And then after that, I started working in Monaghan as heritage officer for 18 years. And that was quite a lot. When I was there, mainly I started a lot of wetland work, really, because I could see there was a threshold that had been reached in Monaghan, and other people could see it as well, in that there's a lot of wetlands being filled in. The wetlands in Monaghan are different than the Midland wetlands. They're smaller little interdrumline hollows, really. Still in all, there was a huge amount of destruction going on and drainage going on. And when we started to look at that specific impact, we could see that in within 6 years, 10% of Monaghan's wetlands had been lost at that time, and that was 2006, just in that short period of 6 years. So that was a big wake-up call, really.
So then that brought you into the area of wetlands, and then coming back to the change of Boardnamona and the pivot it made. So has that been challenging for people in the Midlands, and how has that been handled? I know there's something called the Just Transition Fund, so maybe we can chat about that a bit, Shirley.
That's right, yes. It has been challenging for people in the Midlands. It was a very secure line of work. There was a lot of professional jobs there and also operative jobs. So a wide range of skills and expertise is needed. And it has been a big loss to people in the Midlands, both, I think, psychologically, from the point of view of security and stability, and also then economically, obviously, and socially as well, because there was a huge social life went on with all of that.
Of course.
And there's this new EU Just Transition Fund, which is aiming to help regions, I suppose, pivot to climate neutrality, particularly where they've been fossil fuel dependent. So there'd be other regions in Europe, there might be steel regions, for example, car manufacturing regions that are also aligned with the Midlands in this. And the project that I'm running is called Tóchar, which is implementing the degraded peatland wetland part of the overall programme. And we've called our programme Tóchar in recognition of that cultural link with wetlands. So we're trying to work on those kind of legs of the stool, the social, the economic, and the environmental together to kind of give it a whole systems approach through our project, which isn't long up and running. But the social justice part, I'm very conscious of that. I really am. I
It's
think
very,
it's fundamental.
I mean, it's important, obviously, because burning turf had a huge amount of greenhouse gases extracting,
Mhm.
and that couldn't continue. And of course,
No,
renewables are important, but the transition can have people fall in the middle, particularly
exactly.
if people are older. So it's definitely a time of transition. And Bord Namona, as it became a green company, then decided that the bogs would be the place for solar and for wind energy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. They have quite a few wind farms either up and running or in planning. And they're looking also at solar farms as well. And they've been putting in cycling tracks on some, I suppose, drier bits as well. And they've been doing a lot of restoration. But so, and they're also kind of a green company that deliver environmental services. So they have pivoted, and there's definitely a feeling amongst the community that Bord Namona as a commercial entity has successfully pivoted, but that they haven't maybe been given the same opportunity. So it's very important that we enable other people either to go on that journey as much as we can help them, or that it's okay, if you've got a shed of turf, for example, that's been dug. I mean, I'm not going to stop older persons in their homes who aren't able to make a transition to another fuel to stop burning
Turf.
that turf, even though it's emitting fuels, because we all are doing things in our lives that are not perfect.
Yes, that's true. And so burning turf in your home, that's a transition. Eventually, you were saying that houses are
It's
being
it's
built with
phasing out. Houses are being built with no chimneys anymore. This isn't going to be continuing. The commercial sale of turf is banned, so you can't commercially buy turf. So the only way you can have turf is if you're still cutting your own turbary bank, basically on a non-protected site. So the amount of people that will be burning turf and are has reduced and will continue to reduce because of that context.
right. The turbary, that was an interesting word that you used. What were the turbary rights?
Yeah, the turbary rights were essentially you were given a strip of land through your landlord when the landlords owned the land and you were a tenant, and you had a turf bank associated with your house. And so then you had the right to cut turf for your own use and to put it out to dry as well. So that's a turbary right. So it's a bit like having fishing rights or all those other kind of rights associated. So it's a turbary right.
Wonderful. And then the other word, which is fascinating, is the toher, which is another word for like boher. And I
Yeah.
thought that was so amazing that we have a different word for a har, which is a way. So bohar was the way of the cow, and toher was the way across the bog.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Isn't it lovely? And toe to dig as well. Like, so it's a lovely word. And it's an archaeological word as well, you know what I mean? So it's that cultural piece, which I feel it's very important that we recognize our long lives lived with bogs, over the generations.
Yeah, and the
And
word
I think,
bog being soft, tug.
yeah, it does.
And of
Yeah.
course, what you're saying about burning turf and the hearth, being the heart of the home, and Níl Aon Tintán mar the Tintán féin.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
many. So it's so important. I was telling you that I went to Lollymore to go on a biodiversity boardwalk. That's a beautiful site in
In
Kildare.
Kildare.
And they had an exhibition, and inside you went, and there was a creel of turf against the fireplace, and then they actually had a turf fire burning, and it was just so it's so primal for us looking at fire, an open
Oh,
fire.
oh, it is. And Yuval Harari, isn't that his name? Who's written those books on Sapiens and Sapiens. I think he's recognized the value of storytelling around the fire being very important for human brain development and our evolution and our passing on of knowledge. And, they call it now the transmission of intangible heritage, that, just passing on of stories and lore and local information and how to find plants and how to go about living in a particular area. That all would have been passed on
Yes,
around the
fire.
fire.
Fire. So, how this transition to renewable and everything being created by the
And
solar and not having fireplaces in our home and all this is a big transition. Can you recommend any books, movies, or documentaries our listeners might like on bogs and wetlands? I saw you had that historic book of Bord Namona there, which was interesting, but
I do. I was thinking about this and I was thinking there's a great book, but you have to go to the library for it if you really want a deep dive. And it's John Feehan and Grace O'Donovan's book called The Bogs of Ireland. And it's a super book. I mean, there's no other better book, really, to be honest, than that one particular. And then I was thinking about children, and there's this great book, and it's done by the Lions Clubs of Ireland, and it's called The Lions, the Bees, and the Bogs. And it's absolutely brilliant. And the Lions Clubs are giving these out for free to schools. And it's beautifully illustrated by Dolores Keaveney and written by her. And it gives the story of archaeology, plants and animals on bogs. I mean, it's just beautiful. It's really lovely book. And
it's for 5-year-olds, I'd say, but it's
no, it's not. It's for everybody. Everybody could read this. It's just beautiful. But I just really want to recommend it because I just think it's such a great book. There's something to make you really see how fantastic bogs are. If you look at Fratina Claffey, she's a wildlife photographer and she's done some beautiful books on bogs. She's done one called The Tapestry of Light, and I just can't remember the name of her other one off the top of my head. But they're absolutely micro photography of plants and animals that live in bogs. And they're stunning, stunning, I
wow,
have to say. And
wonderful.
you could just delve your way through them. They're so beautiful. And then from a movie, can I suggest a YouTube video called There's Magic Under Monaghan, which is a video about bogs and carbon aimed at children, but a good laugh for anybody of any age. And it's 10 minutes long, and it'll be 10 minutes of a good laugh if you're looking for something enjoyable to watch. And we've got a young teacher, John Sharpson, who also did the schools program on TG Cahar during lockdown a few years ago, and he is jaunting himself across the bog. And it's brilliant. So I would recommend that.
Well, that's all sounds very wonderful. And Shirley, just before we finish, I just wanted to ask one question, which I feel maybe is really important. With climate change, it's important that we're not extracting and creating more greenhouse gases, but it's really important how we handle flooding, because flooding seems to be such an issue with heavier rains and storms and rising sea levels and rising groundwater and all of that. So when we have very dry areas or compacted areas, when the soil is very compacted, this is problematic. I'm just sort of reiterating how necessary it is that we have places that can absorb water. So
Mm,
just speak a little bit more about that so people really understand the importance of restoring
yeah.
plants.
Yeah, wetlands and bogs, they all have a really important role in flood control, just exactly what you're saying there. It's that they hold back water because of the particular plants that are on those sites. They actually retain water and they slow it down. So they slow it going back into rivers, for example. So the outflow then, it doesn't rush downstream. It's held back in the wetland and then it gradually is filtered through all that plant and that soil and that peat, filtered out. And so it stops those big flood instances downstream. So even in England, for example, at the moment, they're creating wetlands upstream of vulnerable towns. And it's really made a difference in some places that towns are no longer being flooded because they've done this wetland work upstream of areas that are prone to flooding. So then you're getting a win-win. You're cleaning the water, you know what I mean? You're filtering the water and you're also holding holding it back from towns, but also creating places for nature at the same time. And our existing wetlands do that function, but because they're being degraded and damaged, they're not able to fulfill that as much as they did in the past. So even if you're not tremendously interested in nature, maybe, or you're not really interested in maybe climate even, change per se or carbon per se, I'm sure you're pretty interested when everything's flooding and you've got an intense rainfall event, and that they really are important places in that time. And even if you see the coastal mangroves and things like that in other countries, how they fulfill that role for protecting cities from big tidal surges and things. So they really are very important places.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. No matter what your interest is, we don't want our basements flooding or our houses flooding and furniture and carpets getting damaged. So being surrounded by sponges
Exactly.
that absorbs the water, protects the urban areas or the living areas. And that's so important with flooding becoming such an issue. So that's wonderful, Shirley. Thank you so much for chatting with me today for Cornucopia Climate Chats on bogs and wetlands. And one last question. Are there any eco-tourist places that you would suggest that families go, like the Lullymore one in Kildare, or are there others that you would suggest that people can go and see the bogs and see the
Oh,
plant?
there's loads. Well, I mean, Connemara National Park is full of blanket bog, but also Abbey Leaks bog, which is just beside Abbey Leaks town, which has loads of lovely boardwalks. And that's a nice one because they've done so much restoration works over the last 20 years. So that's Abbey Leaks in County Laois. Lullymore, as you mentioned, is lovely because you get the whole kind of experience and cultural piece there as well. And they have a few climate-y pieces, don't they, in carbon, bits of information about climate and carbon. And then also Clara Bog in County Offaly has some wonderful boardwalks there as well that you can actually get up onto higher pieces of the bog and get the appreciation of the dome. So they'd be three. I'll plug Slieve Bay in County Monaghan because you can go for a nice walking trail across the border there amongst the plateau of the upland blanket bog there. So there's no shortage. I really mean it. You just have to sort of plug it into your all trails.
And it's all there, and there is
Yeah,
a
all there.
beautiful day when I went to Lullymore. I was absolutely amazed at the peace and quiet and being out there. As a child, I used to bring sandwiches to the bog on my uncle's farm when the people were cutting the turf there. I remember that as a child with my auntie. So I will just finish by saying Tóchar buggy. Uh, thank you so much, Shirley.
Here, my God.
Okay, take care now. Bye bye.
Okay, Sloan.
Thank you for the work.